The moon called Gravehold did not have a real name once. It had a number, a string of letters and digits that meant nothing to anyone who was not a fleet clerk. The people who lived there now, the last scraps of a broken human fleet, had given it a new name because it fit. Gravehold was where old ships went to die, and where old memories went to rot, and where nobody expected anything good to happen ever again. Mira Voss had grown up on Gravehold, which meant she had grown up walking between the bones of dead warships. She was 23 years old, small and quick. With short black hair, she cut herself using a knife, because there was no time to waste on anything else. Her hands were rough, from years of pulling wire and metal out of dead machines. She did not remember a time before the war. She had been born during it in a cargo hold while her mother was 3 weeks from death and her father was already gone, lost somewhere out past the Kell Belt when a Skarn strike cracker tore his ship in half. The war had a name. People called it the Withering War, because that was what it had done to humanity. It had withered them down. Once, humans had built colonies across 40 star systems. Once, humans had fleets that could blacken the sky with drive flares. Once, humans had been proud, loud, and dangerous. Now there were maybe 2 million humans left, scattered across a dozen broken rocks, hiding from an enemy that outnumbered them 1,000 to 1. The enemy was the Skarn Dominion, and the Skarn did not hate humans. That was the strange part. Mira had heard old soldiers say it more than once, usually late at night when the ration wine had loosened their tongues. The Skarn did not hate humanity. They simply believed humanity should not exist as anything more than servants. The Skarn had an empire built on order, on obedience, on species that knew their place. Humans, it turned out, did not know their place. Humans never had. That was why the Withering War had lasted 11 years and still was not over, even though humanity had lost almost everything. Mira did not think about any of that most days. She thought about food and fuel cells, and whether the recycler in Bay 9 was going to hold together for one more winter. She thought about her little brother, Tomas, who was 11, and still believed things were going to get better. She let him believe it. It cost nothing to let a child believe in something. The settlement itself was not much to look at. It had grown up inside the wreck of an old colony transport called the Endeavor, a ship so large that when it crashed into Gravehold's surface nearly 40 years ago, it had simply stayed there, half buried, and become the bones of a town. People lived in its cargo holds and its crew decks, patched the hull breaches with scavenged plating, and ran power through cables that had been repaired so many times, nobody remembered the original wiring anymore. Beyond the Endeavor's broken hull, a scattering of pressurized domes housed the hydroponics bays that kept everyone fed, barely, on thin protein paste and stunted vegetables grown under weak artificial light. Commander Aldrich Reyes ran what passed for a military on Gravehold, though calling it a military was generous. He had 18 working fighters, most of them older than Mira, patched together from parts of 3 different fleets that no longer existed. He had 400 able-bodied defenders, armed with rifles that jammed more often than they fired. He had, above all, the impossible task of stretching almost nothing across the defense of nearly 6,000 lives, and he had been doing it for 11 years without once complaining where anyone could hear him. Mira liked Reyes, in the distant way you like someone who carries a burden you are grateful not to carry yourself. He had known her father. He had been the one to tell her mother that the ship in the Kell Belt was not coming home. He checked on Tomas sometimes, brought him small things, a piece of real chocolate once, saved from some supply run that Tomas had made last 3 weeks by only allowing himself 1 bite a day. Reyes was tired in the way that everyone on Gravehold was tired, a tiredness that went all the way down to the bone, but he had never once let that tiredness turn into surrender. It was Reyes who had stood in the settlement's council chamber, an old briefing room inside the Endeavor's command deck, just 1 week before Mira found the door in the tunnel, and told the assembled council exactly how bad things had become. 2 more incursions, he had said, his voice flat, the voice of a man who had run out of ways to soften bad news. Maybe 3 if we're fortunate. That is what our current defenses can absorb. After that, the Skarn patrol pattern in this sector puts a full strike group within range, and a strike group does not send scouts. A strike group ends colonies. He had looked around the room at the council members, farmers and engineers and old soldiers wearing the title of leadership because someone had to. We need options. I do not have any to give you. If any of you do, now would be the time. Nobody had answers that day. Mira had been in the back of the room, technically not old enough to sit on the council but present anyway, because someone needed to fix the room's failing environmental controls, and she had listened to the silence that followed Reyes's words, a silence heavier than anything she had felt in years. It was the silence of people who understood, all at once, that hope was a resource, and theirs was almost spent. She thought about that silence now, standing in the tunnel with her pry bar in hand, staring at a locked door that had not been opened in longer than she had been alive. It was, if she was honest with herself later, the reason she did not turn around and walk away. She had been looking for an option. She simply had not expected to find one buried 3 kilometers under her own feet. That morning, she was 3 kilometers under the surface of Gravehold, in a tunnel that had not been opened in longer than she had been alive. She had not meant to find it. She had been chasing a broken vein of copper wiring, the kind of thing that kept the settlement's lights on for another week, and the vein had led her through a service duct that was not on any map anyone still had. The duct had led to a door. The door had a wheel lock, old style, the kind from before automatic seals became standard. It took her almost an hour to break it loose with a pry bar and her own stubbornness. Behind the door was a chamber the size of a cargo hangar, carved straight into the moon's rock, and in the middle of the chamber stood something Mira had never seen before. It was a machine, that much was clear. It stood on 2 thick legs, easily 15 meters tall, built in the rough shape of a human but far too heavy and far too strong to be mistaken for one. Its armor plating was matte black, scored in places with old battle damage that had never been repaired. Cables as thick as Mira's waist ran from the ceiling into its back, like it had been plugged in and simply left there. Dust had settled so thick on its shoulders that it looked more like a statue than a war machine. A statue built by someone who had wanted to remember something and had run out of time before finishing. On its chest, in letters that had mostly flaked away, was a stenciled designation, Prometheus 0. Below that, smaller, almost gone, experimental, do not reactivate without command authorization. Mira stood there for a long time, her breath fogging in the cold air, her flashlight beam shaking slightly, because her hand was shaking slightly. She had grown up around wrecked warships. She knew what dead machines looked like. This did not look dead. It looked like it was waiting. She should have left. She told herself that later, many times, and every time she knew it was a lie, because she had never once in her life been able to walk away from something broken without wanting to know why. She found the terminal at the base of the machine's left leg, half buried under a fall of loose rock. It took her 2 hours to clear it, and another hour to get the panel open, and when she finally got power flowing into it from a portable cell she had dragged down from the surface, the terminal screen flickered to life with a soft green glow that felt, in that dark stone room, almost like the first light of morning. A cursor blinked, then text began to scroll. System check. Prometheus 0 last active. 47 years, 3 months, 11 days ago. Status: dormant core integrity, 94%. Awaiting command authorization. 47 years. Mira did the math without meaning to. 47 years ago was before the Withering War had even started. 47 years ago, humanity still had an actual fleet, actual colonies, actual hope. Whatever this thing was, it had been built and then buried before the war that was now killing everyone she loved had even begun. She should have called someone, she knew that. There was a chain of command on Gravehold, thin and tired as it was. Commander Aldrich Reyes ran what was left of the fleet's ground forces, and anything this big, this old, and this clearly military should have gone straight to him. But there was a small, stubborn voice in her that had kept her alive through 11 years of war, and that voice told her that if she called it in right now, it would become someone else's discovery, someone else's decision, and she was so tired of watching decisions get made by people who did not have to live with the consequences. So she typed a command instead, just to see, just to know. Request status report. The response came slower this time, like something deep inside the machine was stirring awake after a very long sleep. Status report. Prometheus 0 is a prototype autonomous combat unit, Class Titan, developed under the Iron Dawn program. Unit was decommissioned prior to full operational deployment. Reason for decommissioning: classified. Authorization required for further details. Mira frowned at the screen. Classified. Of course it was classified. Everything that mattered was always classified. Right up until the people who classified it were dead and gone, and nobody was left to explain why. She thought about Tomas, sleeping in their shared quarters back at the settlement, 11 years old and thin because there was never quite enough food. She thought about the last supply run, when the Skarn patrol boats had chased the convoy so close that 2 of the 4 ships never made it back. She thought about the way Commander Reyes had looked just last week, when he told the settlement council that Gravehold's defenses would not hold past another 2 Skarn incursions, not without a miracle nobody had any right to expect. She looked up at the towering shape of Prometheus 0, silent and dust-covered, and waiting in the dark, and she made a decision that would change everything. Request full activation. The terminal screen flickered red. Warning: full activation requires command-level authorization. You are not recognized as authorized personnel. Mira's jaw tightened. She had expected that. Machines like this were never built to listen to nobodies like her. Override request. Authorization code unknown. Attempt manual system bypass. Warning: manual bypass may damage core systems. Proceed? She should have said no. She knew that too. The same way she had known she should have called Commander Reyes the moment she found the door. But she thought of the settlement's dwindling defenses, and the Skarn patrol boats getting bolder every month, and the way the adults around her had started talking about evacuation like it was inevitable, like Gravehold was already lost, like everyone she had ever known was just waiting for the day the sky finally fell on them. Yes. Proceed. She worked for 6 more hours, splicing cables with hands that had gone numb from the cold, rerouting power through junctions that had not carried a current in nearly half a century, following diagrams she found buried in the machine's own maintenance logs because there was no one alive to teach her how any of this worked. Twice she thought she had killed it for good, when the terminal screen went black and stayed black for long, terrifying minutes. Twice it came back. Finally, near midnight by the settlement's clocks, though there was no real day or night 3 kilometers underground, the last connection clicked into place. The chamber went dark for 1 heartbeat. Then Prometheus 0 opened its eyes. They were not eyes exactly, not in the way Mira had eyes. They were twin sensor clusters set into the machine's featureless head, and when they lit, they did not glow gently like the terminal screen had. They burned, a hard, clean white, bright enough that Mira had to throw an arm up to shield her face. The light swept the chamber once, twice, and then settled directly on her, small and shaking, and covered in half a century of dust, standing at the base of something built to fight wars she had never even heard of. For a long moment nothing happened. Mira's heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Then a voice came from the machine, deep and resonant, carrying a strange dual quality, as if 2 voices were speaking in perfect unison, one flat and mechanical, the other, underneath it, unmistakably human. System reboot complete, it said. Then, after a pause that felt far too long, far too considering for a machine, it spoke again, quieter this time. How long was I gone? Mira did not answer right away. She could not. Her mouth had gone dry. Answer the query, the machine said, and this time there was something almost like urgency in its voice. How long? 47 years, Mira managed, give or take. The great head tilted downward, sensor lights narrowing slightly, an expression that should not have been possible on a face with no real features and yet somehow was. 47 years, it repeated. Then the war I remember beginning is not the war that is happening now. It was not a question. Mira felt a cold feeling settle in her stomach, the feeling of standing at the edge of something far bigger than herself. There's a war happening now, she said slowly, against the Skarn Dominion. It's been going 11 years. We're losing. We're losing badly. The machine was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, the human undertone in its voice had grown stronger, almost pained. The Skarn, it said. I know that name. I was built because of that name. You know them? I fought them, Prometheus Zero said. Or I was built to. I do not fully remember why I was stopped before I could. The sensor lights flickered, a strange stuttering motion, like a person blinking hard to clear their vision. There are gaps, deliberate ones. Someone removed pieces of me before they put me down here in the dark. Mira swallowed hard. Why would someone do that? I do not know yet, the machine said, but I intend to find out. It shifted its weight, and the whole chamber trembled with the sound of ancient hydraulics groaning back to life after decades of silence, dust sifting down from the ceiling like gray snow. What is your designation, small one? Mira, she said. Mira Voss. Mira Voss, the machine repeated, as if testing the shape of the words. You woke me. That means something, whether you intended it to or not. The white light of its sensors softened very slightly, and when it spoke next, the voice sounded almost gentle, almost the way an old soldier might speak to a child who had stumbled into a war they did not start. Tell me about this dominion. Tell me everything, and tell me what has become of my people while I slept. So Mira did. She sat down on an overturned crate at the base of the giant machine, in a chamber that had been sealed for 47 years, and she told Prometheus Zero about the fall of the outer colonies, and the loss of Earth's old fleet, and the slow retreat of what remained of humanity into hiding, scavenging, surviving on rocks like Gravehold that nobody wanted because nobody thought they were worth taking. She told it about her father, lost in the Kell Belt. She told it about Tomas, growing up thin and scared in a world that had never once been kind to him. She told it about Commander Reyes, and the 2 Skarn incursions that Gravehold's defenses would not survive. Prometheus Zero listened to all of it without interrupting. Its great head bowed slightly toward her, and when she finally finished, the chamber was silent except for the soft hum of its systems, fully awake now after nearly half a century of sleep. 11 years of losing, it said finally. 11 years of your people hiding in the dark, waiting to be found and finished. The sensor lights flared, brighter, harder, the white burning almost blue at the edges. That ends now. You don't even know what you can do yet, Mira said. You said yourself there are gaps, pieces missing. There are, Prometheus Zero agreed. But there is one thing that is not missing, Mira Voss. One thing I remember with perfect clarity, buried deeper than any deletion could reach. The great machine straightened to its full height, and for the first time, Mira understood that she was not simply looking at a weapon. She was looking at something that had once had a purpose, a soul of sorts, forged in fire and buried before it could finish what it started. I remember why I was built, it said. I remember what humanity was, before it learned to be afraid, and I remember exactly what it takes to make an empire like the Skarn Dominion, regret ever deciding that my species belonged on its knees. Far above them, 3 kilometers up on the surface of Gravehold, the settlement's early warning system began to chirp softly, an alert nobody was awake to hear yet, marking the approach of a Skarn scout craft on its routine patrol of the outer system. It was nothing unusual. It happened every few days. Nobody down in that buried chamber knew about it yet, and it would be hours before the scout craft's sensors picked up the faint, impossible power signature, now bleeding up through 47 years of dust and rock and silence. But it was coming, and when it arrived, it would be the first sign to the Skarn Dominion that something very old, and very dangerous, had just woken up in the dark. Mira looked up at Prometheus Zero, at the machine that had been decommissioned, abandoned, and forgotten by everyone who built it, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. It was small and fragile, and she was almost afraid to name it, because things like it had a way of getting crushed on Gravehold before they had a chance to grow. It was hope. So what happens now? She asked. The white sensor lights turned toward the tunnel that led back up to the surface, back to the settlement, back to a war that had been going on far longer than anyone had ever intended. Now, Prometheus Zero said, I remember everything, and then I go to work. It took Mira almost 4 hours to climb back to the surface, moving slowly through tunnels that felt narrower than they had on the way down, her mind still spinning with everything she had seen and heard. Prometheus Zero did not follow her, not yet. It had told her, in that strange doubled voice, that it needed time to run full diagnostics, to search through what remained of its own memory for the pieces someone had tried so hard to erase. It had asked her to bring someone with authority. It had asked her, more than once, not to be afraid. She found Commander Reyes exactly where she expected to, in the cramped operations room built into the Endeavor's old bridge, hunched over a status board with dark circles under his eyes, coordinating the next supply run with two tired-looking pilots. He looked up when she came in, covered head to foot in dust, her hands shaking from more than just the cold. "Voss," he said, and something in her face must have alarmed him, because he was on his feet before she had said a single word. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "I'm not hurt," she said. "Commander, I need you to come with me, right now, and I need you to bring someone you trust to keep this quiet, because if this gets out before we understand it, it's going to cause a panic, or worse." Reyes studied her for a long moment, the way he studied everything, weighing the cost of every possible response before choosing one. Then he reached for his sidearm out of habit, more than actual suspicion, and nodded once. "Lead the way," he said. The two pilots stared after them as they left, and Mira heard one of them mutter something about Voss finally cracking under the pressure like everyone always figured she would. She did not bother to correct them. There would be time enough for that later, once Reyes had seen the truth for himself. They took the long service elevator down as far as it would go, then walked the rest, Reyes falling silent as the tunnels grew older and stranger around them, his flashlight beams sweeping walls that had clearly not seen human hands in decades. When they reached the broken door, he stopped and stared at the faded stencil warning bolted beside it, the words "Iron Dawn Program," barely legible under a crust of corrosion. "I know that name," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I heard it once, years ago, before the war even started. A rumor, a black-budget project nobody was supposed to talk about." He looked at Mira, and for the first time in a long time, she saw something other than tiredness in his eyes. She saw fear, and underneath the fear, something that might have been hope trying to claw its way back to the surface after 11 years buried. "Tell me you didn't." "I did," Mira said. "You should see it yourself before you decide what to think." Reyes followed her through the door, and when the chamber's sensor lights flared to life, twin points of hard white brilliance sweeping down from 15 meters up to fix on his face, Mira watched a man who had not shown real surprise in over a decade stagger back a full step, one hand rising instinctively toward a weapon that would have done absolutely nothing against what stood before him. "Commander Aldrich Reyes," Prometheus Zero said, and the sound of its voice, deep and doubled and utterly calm, echoed off stone that had not carried the sound of speech in 47 years. "Acting military authority, Gravehold Settlement, remnant of the Ashen Fleet." A pause, brief and strange, almost thoughtful. "I recognize the rank insignia pattern, though the uniform design has changed since I last observed it in active service. You have been fighting a long time, Commander. It shows." Reyes lowered his hands slowly, staring up at the towering machine with an expression Mira had never seen on him before, somewhere between disbelief and something close to grief. "Iron Dawn," he said. "You're real. I always thought it was just a story. Soldiers told each other to feel better." "I am real," Prometheus Zero confirmed. "And I am willing to fight for your people, Commander, if you will have me. But before you decide, you should know that I do not yet understand why I was buried here, or who chose to bury me, or what it is they wanted forgotten. I would ask that you help me find out. I owe it to whoever built me to remember why I existed at all." Reyes was quiet for a long time, looking from the machine to Mira and back again, and when he finally spoke, his voice had steadied into something closer to the tired, determined commander Mira knew. 11 years, he said. 11 years I have watched this settlement bleed a little more every season, and I have had nothing to offer anyone but the truth, which was that we were losing and I did not know how to stop it. He straightened his shoulders, and though he was a small, exhausted man standing in the shadow of something built to end wars, he did not look afraid anymore. "If you are willing to fight for us, Prometheus Zero, then I am willing to give you the chance to remember whatever it is you need to remember, but I need to know one thing first, and I need the honest answer, whatever it costs us." "Ask," said the machine. "When the fighting starts," Reyes said, "and it will start soon, because nothing stays quiet forever, On a moon like this one. Whose side are you actually on? The sensor lights of Prometheus Zero burned steady and white in the dark, and when it answered, there was no hesitation in its voice at all. I was built by humans, for humans, to end a war that humans could not win alone, it said. I do not remember every detail of why that mission was abandoned, but I remember exactly who I am, Commander. I have always been, and will always be, on the side of the people who gave me a reason to exist in the first place. A pause, and then quieter, almost gentle. I am on your side. I always have been. I simply forgot it for a while, buried in the dark, the same way it seems your entire species has been forgotten by everyone who should have come to help. That ends now, Commander Reyes. Whatever it takes. Reyes looked up at the machine for a long moment, and then, slowly, he nodded, the closest thing to a smile crossing his exhausted face that Mira had seen from him in years. Then welcome back to the war, he said. We have a great deal of catching up to do. The Skarn scout craft that had been circling the outer edges of the Gravehold system for 3 days finally picked up the strange power signature at 0400 hours by the settlement's clock, and its automated systems flagged the reading as an anomaly worth a closer look. The scout was small, fast, and unarmed except for a single defensive turret, built for exactly one purpose: to see things and report them home. It adjusted its course, dipped lower toward the moon's cratered surface, and began recording. 3 kilometers below that scout craft, inside the buried chamber that had held Prometheus Zero in silence for 47 years, Commander Reyes was sitting on an overturned crate, listening to a machine describe a war he had never heard of, and slowly coming to understand that everything he thought he knew about humanity's fight against the Skarn Dominion was, at best, only half the story. The Iron Dawn program began 19 years before the war you call the Withering War, Prometheus Zero said. Its great head was angled downward, toward the 2 humans seated far below it, and its voice had settled into something almost like a storyteller's rhythm, patient and deliberate. At that time, humanity had already made first contact with the Skarn Dominion. Contact was not hostile at first. There were negotiations, trade agreements, even, for a brief period, an exchange of cultural delegations. A pause. It did not last. What happened? Mira asked. She was sitting close to Reyes, her knees pulled up to her chest, watching the towering machine with the kind of fascinated attention she usually reserved for engine schematics. The Skarn Dominion is built on a principle they call the Great Order, Prometheus Zero explained. Every species within their territory is ranked according to a set of criteria: technological capability, military discipline, cultural obedience to central authority. Species that rank highly become full citizens. Species that rank poorly become client states, protected but controlled, their industries and militaries folded into the Dominion's own structure. The sensor lights dimmed slightly, an expression that might have been something like old anger. Humanity was evaluated. Humanity was ranked very low on obedience to central authority, and very high on what the Skarn evaluators termed unpredictable aggression. The recommendation was clientage. Full absorption, an end to independent human governance, sold to your ancestors as protection. Reyes's jaw tightened, and humanity said no. Humanity said no, Prometheus Zero confirmed, and there was something almost like pride buried in its mechanical voice. Repeatedly, loudly, in ways the Skarn found genuinely difficult to process, because within their own experience, no species had ever refused clientage and survived the resulting war. They did not expect humanity to survive it either. The Iron Dawn program existed to prove them wrong. It went on to explain in careful detail what the program had actually been. Not one machine, but a planned line of them, Titan-class combat units, each one an autonomous war engine built around an experimental core that combined artificial intelligence with something the old engineers had called adaptive memory architecture. The idea, Prometheus Zero explained, was simple in concept and staggeringly difficult in execution. A machine that did not merely follow programmed tactics, but that learned, remembered, and grew more dangerous the longer it fought, drawing on the full accumulated experience of every battle it had ever seen. I was the first, it said, the prototype. There were meant to be others after me, an entire line of Titans, each one built faster and stronger, using lessons learned from my own development. I do not know if any of them were ever completed. That is one of the gaps. The sensor lights flickered again, that strange stuttering motion Mira had noticed before, like static across an old broadcast. Someone removed a great deal of my memory before I was buried here. Not damaged, removed, deliberately, carefully, by someone who understood my systems well enough to do it without destroying me entirely. Why would anyone do that? Mira asked. If you were the answer to beating the Skarn, why bury you and cut out your memory instead of just using you? That, Prometheus Zero said, is what I intend to find out. But I have a working theory, based on the fragments that do remain. It paused, and when it continued, its voice had grown heavier, slower, carrying the weight of something painful. I remember a battle, the Kestrel Line, a defensive position along what was then the border of human space. I remember fighting there. I remember it going badly, though I do not remember why. And I remember, very faintly, a voice giving an order that I refused to follow. Reyes leaned forward. What order? I do not remember the words, Prometheus Zero admitted. Only the shape of the memory, that it was an order I judged to be wrong, and that refusing it had consequences. The great machine straightened, its full 15 meters casting a long shadow across the chamber floor. I believe someone decided that a weapon capable of disobedience was more dangerous than any enemy it might be used against. I believe that is why I was buried here, in the dark, with my memory deliberately cut apart, rather than destroyed outright. Someone wanted me gone, but perhaps could not bring themselves to erase me completely. Perhaps some part of them hoped I would be found again, someday, by someone who needed me more than they feared me. The chamber fell silent. Mira thought of the door she had broken open, the warning stenciled beside it, the 47 years of dust that had settled undisturbed until she came along with a pry bar and more stubbornness than sense. Well, Reyes said finally, his voice rough, I don't much care what order you refused 47 years ago. Right now I have a settlement of 6,000 people who are running out of time, and if even half of what you've told us about what you can do is true, I am not in a position to be picky about your history. He stood, brushing dust from his knees, and looked up at the towering machine with an expression that had hardened into something like resolve. Can you fight? Right now, today, with whatever pieces of yourself you have left. I can fight, Prometheus Zero said. My combat systems are largely intact. It is only certain memories that were removed, not my capabilities. I am, if anything, more dangerous now than I was designed to be at the point of my activation, because the adaptive architecture at my core has continued running background processes for 47 years, even in dormancy, refining and reorganizing what remained. A pause. I do not know exactly what that means for my current capabilities. I have not been tested, but I intend to find out very soon, if the readings I am currently receiving from surface sensors are accurate. Reyes frowned. What readings? A Skarn scout craft, Prometheus Zero said, has been circling this system for the past 3 days on routine patrol. 7 minutes ago, it altered its flight path and began a descent toward the surface directly above this chamber. I believe it has detected the power signature of my reactivation. The color drained from Reyes's face. It's found us. It has found something, Prometheus Zero corrected. Whether it understands what that something is, remains to be seen. Scout craft are built for observation, not confirmation. It is likely attempting to gather data before reporting anything definitive back to Dominion Command. The sensor lights swept toward the tunnel leading up to the surface. But if it succeeds in that reporting, this settlement will no longer be a low-priority target for the Skarn Dominion. A power signature matching Iron Dawn specifications, even a fragment of one, would draw significant attention. They fought against my kind once, Commander. They do not forget what that cost them. Reyes was already moving, pulling a comm unit from his belt, barking orders to bring the settlement's air defenses to full alert, his exhaustion burned away by pure adrenaline. Mira stood too, her heart hammering, watching the machine that had slept for 47 years now turning its full attention toward the surface, toward a threat that had, until this exact moment, been nothing more than routine background noise in the long, grinding war for Gravehold's survival. Can you stop it? She asked. The scout ship, before it reports back. I can attempt to, Prometheus Zero said, but I would need to reach the surface, and this chamber was not built with an exit large enough for my current frame. Someone sealed me in here permanently, Mira Voss. Whoever buried me did not intend for me to ever climb back out on my own. Mira looked around the chamber, at the thick stone walls, the collapsed sections of tunnel she had barely managed to squeeze herself through, and felt her stomach sink. There has to be another way out. A cargo elevator, a blast door, something built for a machine your size to have gotten down here in the first place. There likely was, Prometheus Zero agreed, but 47 years is a long time, and moons shift, and rock settles. I am running structural scans now. A pause, longer this time, the chamber humming faintly as unseen systems churned through decades-old data. There is a secondary shaft, roughly 600 meters from our current position, sealed by a collapse that appears to be approximately half the age of my own dormancy here. It may have been deliberately triggered to prevent exactly this scenario from occurring, or it may simply be moonquake damage. I cannot determine which from here. Reyes had finished his call, his face grim. Whatever it is, we don't have time to dig it out by hand. Air defense is scrambling now, but 4 fighters against even a single Skarn scout with escort support inbound is not odds I like. Then I will find another way, Prometheus Zero said, and something in its voice had shifted, hardened, taken on an edge that made the hair on the back of Mira's neck stand up. It was not anger exactly. It was something older and colder than anger, the sound of a weapon remembering, all at once and very clearly, exactly what it had been built to do. The great machine took one heavy step forward, servos and hydraulics groaning after 47 years of silence, and pressed one massive hand flat against the chamber's rear wall, the same wall that backed onto 600 meters of collapsed rock and the sealed shaft beyond it. Dust sifted from the ceiling. The whole chamber trembled. Commander Reyes, Prometheus Zero said, I would advise you and Mira Voss to retreat to the tunnel entrance. What I am about to attempt will not be quiet. Reyes did not argue. He grabbed Mira's arm and half-dragged her toward the broken doorway, and the last thing Mira saw as she looked back over her shoulder was Prometheus Zero drawing its fist back, servo motors screaming with barely contained power, before driving it forward directly into the stone wall, with a force that shook the entire chamber like a moonquake. The impact was deafening. Rock shattered and fell in great sheets, dust exploding outward in a choking cloud, and Mira felt the shockwave of it in her teeth, in her bones, in the marrow of her arms as she threw herself against the tunnel wall for stability. Again the machine struck, and again, each blow sending fresh cracks spiderwebbing through stone that had stood undisturbed for longer than the settlement itself had existed. On the 4th strike, something gave way entirely, a section of wall collapsing inward with a roar like a dying beast, and through the settling dust, Mira saw a widening gap of open darkness where solid rock had been only moments before. Structural integrity confirmed, Prometheus Zero said, its voice calm again, almost conversational, as if it had not just punched through solid stone with its bare hand. The secondary shaft is accessible. I estimate 11 minutes to reach the surface at maximum ascent speed. 11 minutes might not be fast enough, Reyes said grimly, watching the readouts on his comm unit. That scout's already transmitting a preliminary report. If it gets a full data burst out before you reach the surface, this whole system goes from ignored backwater to marked target in about the time it takes to blink. Then I will simply have to be faster than 11 minutes, Prometheus Zero said, and Mira thought she heard something almost like amusement buried under the machine's flat mechanical tone, an echo of whatever grim humor its long-dead human builders might have carried into their own wars. It moved toward the gap in the wall, each footstep sending fresh tremors through the chamber floor, and paused just before the darkness swallowed it, turning its sensor lights back toward the 2 humans standing in the ruined doorway. Mira Voss, it said. Commander Reyes, whatever happens on the surface in the next several minutes, I want you both to understand something clearly, because it may be some time before I have the opportunity to say it again. The white lights burned steady in the dust-choked dark. I was built to protect humanity from an empire that believed my species incapable of standing on its own. I spent 47 years buried in silence, my memory torn apart, forgotten by everyone who once believed in what I could do. But I am awake now, and I remember, more clearly with every passing minute, exactly what I am for. It turned back toward the gap, toward the long climb to the surface and the scout craft waiting somewhere above, and its final words echoed back through the tunnel long after its massive frame had vanished into the dark. Let them see what happens when the Skarn Dominion forgets that humanity does not stay buried. Mira and Reyes did not wait in the ruined chamber. They ran, following the old service tunnels back toward the surface, as fast as the narrow, broken passages would allow, Reyes shouting updates into his comm unit the entire way, coordinating with the settlement's operations room in short, clipped bursts. By the time they reached the surface access hatch near the main hydroponics dome, the settlement's alarm klaxons were already wailing across Gravehold, a sound so rare that people were spilling out of homes and workstations in confusion, staring up at the pale, star-flecked sky, trying to understand what threat could possibly be big enough to warrant a full alert in the middle of the night cycle. Reyes shoved through the gathering crowd toward the operations center, dragging Mira with him, and the two of them burst into the cramped room just in time to see the tactical display flicker with a new contact. Deep beneath the settlement, a massive energy signature was rising through solid rock at a speed the sensors struggled to properly track, climbing toward the surface like something being born. "Confirm that reading," Reyes barked at the young sensor operator hunched over the console, a woman named Priya who had not slept properly in 3 days, and looked, in that moment, like she was not entirely sure she was still awake. "Confirmed, Commander," Priya said, her voice unsteady. "Whatever that thing is, it's moving through solid rock at almost 40 meters a second. That shouldn't be possible." "It's not moving through the rock," Mira said, catching her breath. "It's punching through it." On the main view screen, patched together from feeds across the settlement's remaining sensor network, the Skarn scout craft continued its slow, deliberate descent toward the surface above the collapsed shaft, sleek and dark against the starfield, its sensor array sweeping the ground below in careful, methodical passes. It was not built for combat, but its automated defense turret was more than capable of killing anything unarmored that came within range, and its onboard systems had already begun compiling a full data burst, ready to transmit the moment its scans confirmed what its instruments were telling it should be impossible. The ground 300 meters from the settlement's outer perimeter erupted. Rock and dust exploded upward in a column that caught the thin moonlight and turned it into a strange, glittering cloud, and out of that cloud rose Prometheus Zero, 15 meters of matte black armor trailing chains of broken stone, its sensor lights burning hard and white against the darkness of the lunar night. It did not pause to survey its surroundings. It did not hesitate. The moment its head cleared the surface, it was already moving, covering the distance toward the descending scout craft in great, ground-shaking strides that sent shockwaves rippling through the loose regolith. Inside the operations center, the entire room fell silent, every eye fixed on the main view screen, watching something impossible unfold in real time. The Skarn scout craft's automated systems reacted with the speed of pure programming, swinging its defensive turret around and opening fire the instant its threat assessment protocols registered the approaching contact as hostile. Bright bolts of energy lanced down through the darkness, striking Prometheus Zero across the chest and shoulder in rapid succession, and Mira found herself gripping the edge of the console hard enough to hurt, certain she was about to watch the machine that had just saved her life get torn apart by weapons fire. Prometheus Zero did not slow down. The energy bolts scorched black lines across its armor plating, but the machine simply absorbed the hits, its heavy stride never breaking, closing the final distance to the scout craft in what felt to Mira like both an eternity and no time at all. When it reached the vessel, still hovering low for its scanning pass, it did not use any weapon system at all. It simply reached up with both massive hands, seized the scout craft's hull by the forward sensor array, and pulled. Metal shrieked. The scout craft's hull buckled, its automated turret still firing wildly, bolts scorching harmlessly into the empty dark now that its target had closed to point-blank range, where its targeting systems could no longer properly track. Prometheus Zero planted its feet, servos screaming under the strain, and with one final brutal motion, tore the scout craft's forward section clean away from the rest of its hull. The vessel's systems died in a shower of sparks and venting atmosphere, its transmission array crushed beyond any possibility of sending a completed data burst back to Dominion Command. What remained of the craft, tumbled, powerless, and crashed into the regolith 200 meters from where Prometheus Zero stood, the wreckage skidding to a stop in a spray of dust and broken metal. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, Prometheus Zero turned to face the settlement, its sensor lights sweeping across the gathered crowd of stunned, terrified, disbelieving faces, and it raised one scorched, dented hand in a gesture that could only be read as a greeting. Back in the operations center, Reyes let out a breath he had clearly been holding since the moment the fighting began, and beside him, Priya was staring at her console with an expression somewhere between shock and disbelieving joy. "Commander," she said quietly, "I don't think that scout got its transmission out." "Not the full burst, anyway. I'm reading a partial signal, maybe 3 seconds of data, cut off mid-transmission." 3 seconds, Reyes repeated. "Is that enough for them to know what happened here?" Priya hesitated, checking her readings again before answering. "Maybe. It's not nothing, Commander, but it's not a confirmed report either. If we're lucky, all Dominion Command gets is a garbled fragment and a scout that stopped transmitting. Could read as equipment failure. Could read as something worse. I honestly don't know." Reyes closed his eyes for a moment, weighing the uncertainty, and then opened them again with the same hard resolve Mira had seen in him 100 times before, the look of a man who had learned long ago that waiting for perfect information was a luxury Gravehold could never afford. "Get every available hand on reinforcing the perimeter," he said. "I want full alert status maintained until we know for certain whether that partial transmission was enough to draw attention. And somebody get me eyes on that thing out there, because in about 30 seconds, every single person on this settlement is going to want to know exactly what just saved our lives." Outside, Mira pushed her way back out through the crowd gathering at the settlement's edge, her heart still hammering, and found herself standing at the front of the line, staring up at the towering, scorched, impossibly still-standing shape of Prometheus Zero, silhouetted against the stars. Tomas had somehow found his way to the front of the crowd too, wide-eyed, clutching the sleeve of an elderly neighbor, staring up at the machine with an expression of pure, uncomplicated wonder that Mira had not seen on her little brother's face in longer than she could remember. "Mira," he breathed, not taking his eyes off the giant machine even as she reached him. "Is that thing ours?" Mira looked up at Prometheus Zero, at the dented armor, and the scorch marks, and the twin sensor lights that swept slowly across the crowd, pausing for just a moment when they found her standing near the front, and she felt that same small, fragile thing stir in her chest again, stronger this time, harder to deny. "Yeah," she said, "it's ours." Prometheus Zero lowered its massive frame into something like a crouch, bringing its head down closer to the level of the gathered crowd, and when it spoke, its voice carried clearly across the settlement, deep and doubled and steady. "People of Gravehold," it said, "my name is Prometheus Zero. I was built by humans very much like yourselves, a long time ago, to fight a war that many believed could not be won. I was buried before I could finish that fight. Today, one of your own woke me, and reminded me exactly what I was made for." The sensor lights swept once more across the crowd, taking in the thin, tired, frightened faces staring back at it. "I cannot promise you that the war ahead will be easy. I cannot promise you that I remember everything I once knew, or that I am strong enough alone to undo 11 years of losses. But I promise you this. For as long as I am able to stand, the Skarn Dominion will have to fight for every single inch of this moon, and they will pay a price for it that they have not paid in a very long time." A silence fell over the crowd, heavy and uncertain, the kind of silence that comes when people who have forgotten how to hope are suddenly, cautiously, being asked to try again. Then, somewhere near the back of the crowd, an old man who had lost 2 sons to the Withering War began, very quietly, to clap. Others joined him, one by one, the sound building slowly across the gathered crowd until it filled the thin lunar air, ragged and disbelieving, and utterly, fiercely alive. Mira stood beside her brother, watching the machine she had woken rise back to its full height above the settlement it had just saved, and understood, with a clarity that settled deep into her bones, that nothing on Gravehold was ever going to be the same again. Somewhere out past the edge of the system, in the cold dark between the stars, A garbled 3-second fragment of transmission was already beginning its long journey toward Dominion Command, carrying with it the first faint whisper of a warning that the Skarn Empire had not heard in nearly half a century. The Titans were not extinct after all. Later that night, once the crowd had finally dispersed and the settlement's alert status had eased down to a wary, watchful calm, Mira found herself back at the edge of the perimeter, sitting on a piece of broken hull plating, looking up at Prometheus Zero where it stood motionless in the dark, still running its own internal diagnostics after the fight. Reyes had gone to oversee the recovery of the wrecked scout craft, hoping to salvage anything useful from its systems before the cold of the lunar night made the work too dangerous to continue. Tomas had finally been coaxed to bed, though not before making Mira promise, 3 separate times, that she would introduce him properly to the giant robot in the morning. "You are troubled," Prometheus Zero said, without turning its sensor lights away from the dark horizon. "Your heart rate and breathing patterns suggest unresolved stress, even though the immediate threat has passed." Mira huffed out something that was almost a laugh. "You can read my heart rate?" "I can read a great many things," the machine said. "It is, admittedly, an unsettling amount of information to have about a person I have known for less than a day. I apologize if it feels invasive." "It's fine," Mira said, and found that she meant it. She wrapped her arms around her knees, staring out at the same dark horizon the machine seemed to be watching. "I keep thinking about that transmission, the 3 seconds that got out before you destroyed the scout." "As do I," Prometheus Zero admitted. "It is possible it means nothing. It is possible it means everything. I do not have enough information to know which, and I dislike operating without sufficient information. It was, I am beginning to remember, one of the primary flaws in my original design specification. My builders wanted a weapon that acted decisively. They did not always account for how much decisive action costs when the information behind it is incomplete." Mira glanced up at the towering shape beside her, scorched and dented from a battle it had won in less than 2 minutes. "Do you regret it? Coming up here so fast? If you'd waited, maybe stayed hidden." "No," Prometheus Zero said, without hesitation. "A scout craft that completes its scan and departs safely draws far less attention than one that vanishes without explanation, but far more attention than one that transmits 3 garbled seconds of static before its signal simply stops. I made the correct choice with the information available to me. I will likely be forced to make many more choices like it in the days ahead, Mira Voss, and I will not always have the luxury of certainty." The sensor lights finally turned to look down at her, steady and calm in the dark. "That is, I am realizing, the true burden my builders intended for me to carry. Not simply the strength to fight, the willingness to decide, and to live with having decided, even when the outcome remains unknown." Mira did not have an answer for that. She simply sat there, in the cold, thin air of a lunar night, beside a machine that had slept for 47 years, and woken to find the world it once knew almost entirely gone, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was not facing the war alone. Above them, the stars wheeled on, indifferent and endless, carrying somewhere within their vast dark distances a fragment of a signal that would, in time, bring the full weight of the Skarn Dominion's attention crashing down upon a moon that had, until today, been small enough to ignore. Neither of them knew yet how little time that would leave them to prepare. 6 days after the scout craft fell silent, a Skarn communications relay deep in the Vesic sector picked up the garbled 3-second fragment and flagged it for priority review. It took another 2 days for that fragment to work its way up through layers of Dominion bureaucracy, from a junior analyst who nearly dismissed it as sensor noise, to a mid-ranking intelligence officer who recognized something familiar buried in the corrupted data, to finally, on the 9th day, the desk of Fleet Marshal Vosikar Thren, commander of the Dominion's 7th Subjugation Fleet, and the officer responsible for the slow, grinding pacification of what remained of human space. Thren was not human, and had no real understanding of human concepts like impatience or dread, but the closest equivalent in Skarn psychology, a kind of cold, focused irritation, settled over him the moment his analysts finished decoding the fragment and displaying its contents. A partial energy signature, matched, with 83% confidence, to a classified human weapons program that Dominion intelligence had believed fully neutralized nearly half a century ago. Iron Dawn, Thren said, the human words strange and clumsy in his mouth, though he had learned to speak them fluently over 11 years of war. I was told these machines were destroyed, all of them, before the war even reached its second year. That was the assessment at the time, Fleet Marshal, said his intelligence chief, a cautious officer named Yorin, who had survived 3 purges by never delivering bad news without also delivering a plan. It appears the assessment was incomplete. 1 unit, at minimum, survived in a dormant state. Location, based on the scout craft's last known position, places it in the Gravehold system, a minor human settlement. Population estimated under 10,000. We have not prioritized that system for direct assault, given its limited strategic value. Thren stared at the projection hovering above his desk, the scorched, half-legible readings pulled from a dying scout's final transmission, and felt that cold, focused irritation sharpen into something closer to genuine concern. He had fought in the early years of the Withering War, before his promotion to fleet command, and he remembered, the way every Skarn officer who had served that long remembered, exactly what the Iron Dawn units had cost the Dominion in the brief window before they vanished from the battlefield entirely. Tell me what you remember of the Kestrel line, Thren said. Yorin's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. The Kestrel line was a human defensive position, Fleet Marshal. Early in the war, before the human fleet was broken, we lost the 3rd Assault Wing there. 6 capital ships, over 2,000 soldiers. To 1 machine, Thren said. 1. A single prototype, and it very nearly held that line alone, against an entire assault wing, before command finally withdrew it, for reasons our intelligence never fully determined. He leaned back, his mandibles clicking together in a gesture that among his own kind conveyed deep and genuine unease. I always assumed the humans destroyed it themselves, unable to control something so dangerous. Now it seems they simply hid it. And now, after 47 years, someone has woken it up again. Shall I redirect a strike group to Gravehold, Fleet Marshal? Yorin asked. A full assault force could neutralize a single unit, regardless of its capabilities, given sufficient numbers. Thren considered this for a long moment, studying the projection, weighing the cost of the Kestrel line against the cost of ignoring a threat that might, if left alone, spread its influence across the remaining human remnant, like a spark catching dry grass. No, he said finally. Not a full strike group, not yet. A single unit responded to a scout, in defense of a settlement it clearly considers worth protecting. That tells me it is bound, whether by programming or genuine loyalty, to the humans of that system. Send a probing force, enough strength to test its true capabilities without committing the resources we would need for a full subjugation assault. I want to know exactly what has been resurrected in the Gravehold system before I decide how much of my fleet I am willing to spend destroying it. And if the probing force fails, Fleet Marshal? Thren's mandibles clicked again, slower this time, a gesture closer to grim resolve than unease. Then I will know the truth of what we are facing, and I will bring the full weight of the 7th Fleet to Gravehold personally, and I will make certain that this time, nothing of the Iron Dawn program survives to be found again. 3 days later, Gravehold's outer sensor network detected the approach of a Skarn strike wing. It was not the full assault Reyes had feared, not yet, but it was far more than a routine patrol. 12 fighter craft, fast and heavily armed, escorting a single medium cruiser that carried enough firepower to level half the settlement in a single sustained barrage. Reyes stood in the operations center, watching the tactical display fill with hostile contacts, and felt the old, familiar weight of dread settle back over him, heavier now than it had been in years, because for the first time in a very long time, he actually had something to lose that felt worth losing. Get everyone to the shelters, he said, full evacuation protocol, and somebody find Voss and tell her to get that machine of hers ready, because we are about to find out exactly what it can do against something bigger than a scout ship. Mira was already 3 steps ahead of the order, sprinting across the settlement toward the open ground at its edge, where Prometheus Zero had taken up a kind of permanent vigil since the night of the scout craft's destruction, using the intervening days to run diagnostics, test its remaining weapon systems, and slowly, carefully, begin recovering fragments of the memories someone had once tried so hard to erase. "You've seen them," she said, breathless, as she reached the machine's feet. "The strike wing. Reyes says it's 12 fighters and a cruiser." "I have seen them," Prometheus Zero confirmed, already turning to face the direction of the incoming contacts, its sensor lights burning brighter than Mira had seen them since the night it woke. "And I recognize the formation pattern. This is not a full assault, Mira Voss. This is a test. Someone in Dominion Command wants to know exactly what I am capable of before committing greater resources against me. Can you beat them?" "I do not know," Prometheus Zero said, with a bluntness that Mira had come to understand was simply how the machine handled uncertainty, refusing to offer false comfort even when comfort might have been kinder. A single scout craft, unarmed and unprepared for close combat, was a simple matter. 12 armed fighters and a cruiser carrying real firepower is a different calculation entirely. I do not have complete data on my own current capabilities. I have not fought a battle of this scale in 47 years, and significant portions of my combat memory remain fragmented or missing entirely. The sensor lights dimmed briefly, an expression Mira had come to recognize as something close to frustration. "What I can tell you is that I intend to fight regardless, because the alternative is allowing that cruiser to bombard this settlement from orbit, and that is not something I am willing to permit, regardless of the odds against me." Mira felt her throat tighten, but she nodded, because there was nothing else to say, and because some small, stubborn part of her had already decided, days ago, that she was not going to spend this war standing safely in a shelter, while the machine she had woken fought alone. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Prometheus Zero's sensor lights turned down toward her, and for a moment, something in its posture softened, an odd, almost tender adjustment in the angle of its massive frame. "I need you to go to the shelters, Mira Voss, and I need you to look after your brother. That is what I need from you." "That's not a real answer." "It is the only answer I am willing to give," the machine said, and there was no room for argument in its tone, though the gentleness remained underneath it. "I was built to carry burdens, so that people like you and Tomas would not have to. Let me carry this one, please." Mira wanted to argue further, wanted to insist that she could help, that she had spent hours poring over the machine's old diagnostic logs and understood its systems better than almost anyone alive. But the look in those burning white sensor lights, patient and immovable, told her the conversation was already over. She backed away, slowly, toward the settlement's shelter entrance, and turned only once to look back at Prometheus Zero standing alone at the edge of Gravehold, facing the direction of an enemy fleet that most human soldiers would have called suicide to face without support. "Come back," she said quietly, not entirely sure the machine's sensors could even pick up the words at that distance. If they did, Prometheus Zero did not answer. It simply stood, unmoving, waiting, as the first streaks of Skarn fighter craft became visible against the star-flecked lunar sky. The battle that followed lasted 11 minutes, though to everyone watching from the shelters, crowded around whatever scavenged view screens the settlement still had working, it felt like it stretched across an entire lifetime. The 12 fighters came in fast, low, spreading into an attack formation clearly designed to overwhelm a single ground target from multiple angles at once, their weapons already charging as they closed the distance. Prometheus Zero did not run. It did not take cover. It stood its ground at the edge of the settlement, and when the first wave of fighters opened fire, it raised both arms, and, for the first time since its reactivation, brought online a weapon system that had lain dormant even longer than the rest of it. Twin cannons, mounted along its forearms, unfolded from armored housings with a mechanical shriek, and Prometheus Zero opened fire. The response was immediate and devastating. 3 fighters, caught in the first sweeping arc of return fire, disintegrated in bright flashes against the dark sky, before their pilots had time to register what was happening. The remaining 9 broke formation, scattering into evasive patterns, their weapons fire now scattered and less coordinated, as their attack plan collapsed under the weight of a threat far more capable than their intelligence briefing had prepared them for. Prometheus Zero tracked them with a speed that should not have been possible for something so massive. Its targeting systems, 47 years dormant and now running at a capacity even it had not fully understood it possessed, calculating firing solutions faster than any human gunner could have managed. A fourth fighter fell. A fifth. The remaining 7 Skarn pilots, watching their formation collapse in the span of less than 2 minutes, made the only sensible choice available to them and began a full retreat, breaking off their attack run and scattering back toward the waiting cruiser. But the cruiser was not finished. As the surviving fighters fell back, the medium cruiser began its own attack run, dropping low over the settlement's perimeter and opening fire with weapons far heavier than anything the fighters had carried. A sustained barrage of energy fire tore into the ground around Prometheus Zero, throwing up massive clouds of dust and debris, and for a terrible moment, watching from the shelter view screens, Mira lost sight of the machine entirely inside the chaos of the barrage. Then the dust began to clear, and Prometheus Zero was still standing, its armor scorched and cracked in a dozen new places, one shoulder plate hanging loose from damaged mountings, but standing nonetheless, its sensor lights burning even brighter than before, as if the punishment of the barrage had only sharpened its focus, rather than dulling it. "Threat assessment updated," it said, though there was no one nearby to hear it except the wind and the settling dust. "This unit will not fall to a single cruiser. Not today." It moved forward, closing the distance toward the cruiser's low hovering position with the same ground-shaking strides it had used against the scout craft days before, weathering another sustained barrage of weapons fire as it came, armor plating scorching and cracking further with every impact absorbed. When it finally reached the cruiser, close enough that the vessel's heavier weapons could no longer properly track a target at such close range, Prometheus Zero did exactly what it had done to the scout craft, reaching up with both massive hands to seize the cruiser's underside and pull. The vessel was far larger than the scout craft had been, and far better armored, and for a long, terrible moment, it seemed as though the machine's strength alone would not be enough, its feet digging deep furrows into the regolith as it strained against the cruiser's engines, which were now firing at full power, in a desperate attempt to break free and climb back to a safer altitude. Then, with a groan of tortured metal that echoed across the entire settlement, something in the cruiser's engine housing gave way, and the vessel lurched violently, power flickering across its hull as critical systems failed one after another. Prometheus Zero released its grip and stepped back as the crippled cruiser, no longer able to maintain stable flight, began a slow, uncontrolled descent away from the settlement, its remaining crew clearly fighting to regain enough control to avoid a total crash. It did not explode. It did not crash directly into Gravehold. It simply limped away, low and smoking, back toward the dark of open space, trailing the 7 surviving fighters in a ragged, humiliated retreat. Inside the shelters, a ragged cheer went up, disbelieving and fierce, the sound of people who had spent 11 years learning to expect nothing but loss, finally, cautiously, allowing themselves to hope for something else. Mira did not cheer. She was already moving, pushing back out toward the settlement's edge, ignoring Reyes's shouted order to wait for the all-clear, because she needed to see with her own eyes that the machine she had woken was still standing. She found Prometheus Zero exactly where the battle had ended, scorched and cracked and missing a shoulder plate, one arm hanging slightly lower than the other from damaged servos, but upright, its sensor lights tracking the retreating Skarn craft until they finally vanished from visual range entirely. "You're hurt," Mira said, breathless from running, taking in the full extent of the damage now that she was close enough to really see it. "I am damaged," Prometheus Zero corrected, though there was something almost gentle in the correction. "Not hurt, not in the way you mean it, but yes, this frame will require significant repair before I am capable of facing a threat of this scale again." The sensor lights turned down toward her, and the machine's voice, when it continued, carried a weight that had not been there before the battle began. "They will not stop with this, Mira Voss. What arrived today was a test, not a true assault. Whoever commands the fleet responsible for this system now knows exactly what I am, and I suspect they will not underestimate me again." Mira looked out at the dark horizon where the retreating Skarn ships had vanished, and felt the fragile hope of the past few days settle into something harder, more determined, less like wishful thinking and more like resolve. "Then we'd better make sure you're ready for them when they come back," she said, "because something tells me next time they're not sending a test." "No," Prometheus Zero agreed, turning its damaged, scorched, unbroken frame back toward the settlement it had just saved for the second time in a week. Next time, Mira Voss, I believe they will send everything they have. The repairs took 4 days, and Mira spent nearly every waking hour of them at the machine's feet, directing a small crew of settlement engineers through the delicate, exhausting work of patching scorched armor plating and realigning damaged servos with parts scavenged from 3 different derelict warships. It was slow, careful work, made harder by the fact that nothing on Gravehold had been designed with a 15-meter combat titan in mind, and every fix required some new act of improvisation that made Mira grateful, for the first time in years, for a childhood spent learning to make broken things work with whatever scraps were available. Reyes visited often during those 4 days, standing at the edge of the makeshift repair site with his arms crossed, watching the work with the same careful, calculating expression he brought to every decision that mattered. On the 3rd day, he found Mira alone, taking a rare break from the repairs to eat a cold ration bar sitting on an overturned crate near the machine's feet. "The council wants to talk to you," he said without preamble, "about Prometheus, about what happens next." Mira looked up, wary. "What kind of talk?" "The kind where half of them think you're a hero for finding it, and the other half think you've painted a target on this entire settlement that we can't survive." Reyes sat down heavily on a crate across from her, rubbing at his eyes with the particular exhaustion of a man who had not slept properly in longer than he could remember. "For what it's worth, I told them I think you did the right thing, but I won't lie to you, Voss. That cruiser we crippled today didn't die, it ran. And ships that run report back to whoever sent them." "I know," Mira said quietly. "Then you also know that whatever comes next is going to be worse than 12 fighters and a cruiser." Reyes glanced up at the towering, scorched shape of Prometheus Zero above them, silent and unmoving as the repair crew worked along its damaged shoulder. "Is it ready? Really ready? Not just patched up enough to stand?" "It's getting stronger every day," Mira said. "Not just the repairs. It's remembering things. Little pieces, mostly, nothing complete. But every memory it recovers seems to unlock something in its combat systems that wasn't accessible before. Yesterday it remembered an entire tactical subroutine for coordinating with human fighter squadrons that it didn't have access to during the fight with the cruiser. Today it started recalling maintenance protocols that are letting us repair it almost twice as fast as we were managing before." She looked up at Reyes, something fierce and hopeful in her expression that she made no effort to hide. "Whatever they did to bury its memory, they didn't do a very good job of making it permanent. It's coming back, Commander. All of it, eventually. I really believe that." Reyes considered this for a long moment, and then nodded slowly, some of the tension in his shoulders easing, though not all of it. "Then let's hope it remembers fast enough to matter." That night, long after the repair crew had finally gone to rest, Mira remained at the machine's feet, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, and Prometheus Zero broke the comfortable silence between them with something that sounded, for the first time since its reactivation, almost hesitant. "I recovered another memory today," it said, "during the final repair sequence. I have not mentioned it yet because I am still determining what it means." Mira sat up straighter. "What kind of memory?" "A voice," Prometheus Zero said. "Human. Female. I believe she was one of my primary engineers, someone who worked closely on my activation protocols before the Kestrel line." A pause, the sensor lights flickering in that familiar, uncertain rhythm. "I do not have her name. That detail remains missing. But I remember what she said to me, very clearly, in the moments before my first deployment. She said, 'Whatever they tell you to do out there, you decide for yourself what's right. That's the whole point of you. That's why we built you different.'" The machine's voice grew quieter, almost contemplative. "I believe that memory may be connected to whatever order I refused at the Kestrel line. I believe she may have been trying to prepare me for exactly the choice I would later make." Mira felt something tighten in her chest, an ache of sympathy for a machine that had spent 47 years buried with only fragments of the people who had built it, who had believed in it, who had tried to give it something like a conscience before sending it off to fight a war it could not have understood the full cost of. "Do you think she's still alive?" Mira asked quietly, whoever she was. "I do not know," Prometheus Zero said. 47 years is a long time for a human life, and the war has claimed a great many people who might otherwise have lived to see this moment. But I intend to find out, Mira Voss, if such a thing is possible. Whoever she was, she gave me something worth remembering, and I owe her the effort of trying to recover the rest of what she meant to tell me. Above them, the stars continued their slow wheel across the lunar sky, indifferent to the small, fragile hope taking root below, and somewhere far out past the edge of the system, a battered Skarn cruiser was already limping its way back toward Fleet Marshal Thren's flagship, carrying a report that would, within the week, change everything about how the Dominion viewed the quiet, forgotten little settlement on Gravehold. Fleet Marshal Thren received the cruiser's surviving captain in person, standing in the cold, dimly lit debriefing chamber of his flagship, listening without interruption, as the shaken officer recounted, in halting detail, exactly what had happened above the skies of Gravehold. 5 fighters lost outright. A cruiser crippled so badly it would require weeks in a proper shipyard before it could fly a combat mission again. And at the center of it all, a single machine, 15 meters of scorched black armor, standing alone against a full probing force, and walking away the clear victor. "You are certain," Thren said, once the captain had finished, "that this was a single unit, not two, not a coordinated ground defense working in concert." "Certain, Fleet Marshal," the captain said, her voice carefully controlled despite the tremor Thren could detect beneath it. "Sensor logs confirm a single contact throughout the entire engagement. It did not use cover. It did not retreat. It simply stood its ground and destroyed everything we sent against it, one piece at a time, until we had no choice but to withdraw what remained of the force." Thren dismissed the captain and stood alone in the debriefing chamber for a long while afterward, studying the sensor logs projected above the central table, watching the battle replay itself again and again in cold, analytical detail. He had commanded the 7th Subjugation Fleet for 6 years, had overseen the slow, grinding pacification of dozens of human settlements across a dozen different systems, and in all that time, he had never once seen a single unit inflict this level of damage on a properly equipped strike wing. He thought of the Kestrel line, of the reports he had read as a young officer, of the 6 capital ships and 2,000 soldiers lost to a single prototype before Dominion Command finally found a way to force its withdrawal. He had assumed, as most of his generation had assumed, that whatever weakness had allowed that withdrawal had also, eventually, led to the machine's destruction. Now it seemed clear that assumption had been wrong from the very beginning, and the true cost of that error was only now coming due, 47 years later, on a moon so insignificant that Dominion Command had never once considered it worth a second glance. "Yoren," he said, and his intelligence chief stepped forward from the shadows at the edge of the chamber, having waited patiently through the entire debriefing. "I want everything Dominion archives still hold on the Iron Dawn program. Every fragment, every rumor, every half-completed report, our intelligence services gathered during the early years of the war. If there is a weakness to be found in this machine, I intend to find it before I commit the full weight of this fleet to destroying it. And if no weakness exists, Fleet Marshal," Thren's mandibles clicked together, slow and deliberate, the closest his kind came to a grim, humorless smile, "then I will simply have to bring enough firepower that a weakness becomes unnecessary. Either way, Yoren, I want Gravehold reduced to a memory within the month. I will not allow the ghost of the Kestrel line to rise again on my watch, not while I still have the strength of the 7th Fleet at my command." Far across the dark gulf of space, on a small, battered moon that had spent 11 years being nothing more than an afterthought in a war it could not hope to win, a machine that remembered a little more of itself with every passing day stood watch through the long lunar night, unaware that it had just become the single most important target in an entire star sector, and that the full weight of the Skarn Dominion's attention was now, finally, turning its way. The archives Fleet Marshal Thren requested took 11 days to compile, pulled from a dozen different classified caches scattered across Dominion space, translated and cross-referenced by a team of analysts working under Yoren's direct supervision. What they found was not a weakness, not exactly, but something almost as useful: a detailed account of the final months before the Iron Dawn program's disappearance from the war, including partial transcripts of the very battle that haunted Thren's own memory of his early service. The Kestrel line, it turned out, had not fallen because the machine was defeated. It had fallen because human command in the final chaotic weeks of that engagement had ordered the prototype to hold a position that could not be held, sacrificing the soldiers stationed alongside it in a maneuver designed to buy time for a fleet evacuation elsewhere in the system. The prototype had refused. It had instead broken from its assigned position, without authorization, to extract as many of the stranded human soldiers as it physically could, an act that likely saved several hundred lives, but that also, according to the archived transcripts, resulted in the line collapsing entirely, and the loss of the very evacuation the sacrifice had been meant to protect. Thren read the account twice, sitting alone in his private quarters aboard the flagship, and felt something shift in his understanding of the enemy he now faced. "It disobeys," he said quietly, to no one in particular, not out of malfunction, out of something closer to conscience. He set the report aside and stared for a long moment at the star chart glowing above his desk, the small, insignificant marker denoting the Gravehold system pulsing softly amid a sea of far more important Dominion holdings. "That is not a weakness I can exploit with weapons alone, but it may be one I can exploit with strategy." 9 days later, Gravehold's sensor network lit up with contacts in numbers the settlement had never seen before. It was not a probing force this time. It was the 7th Subjugation Fleet's full strike element, dozens of fighters, a full squadron of cruisers, and at the center of the formation, a Dominion battlecruiser, vast enough to blot out a significant portion of the lunar sky, carrying enough firepower to reduce the entire settlement to rubble in a single coordinated barrage. Mira stood beside Prometheus Zero at the edge of the settlement, staring up at the swelling wave of hostile contacts filling the tactical display Reyes had rigged to a portable screen at the machine's feet, and felt something cold and heavy settle into the pit of her stomach. "That's not a test," she said. "No," Prometheus Zero agreed, its sensor lights burning with a steady, focused intensity that Mira had come to recognize as the machine settling fully into whatever version of calm was available, to something built for exactly this moment. "That is everything they have, exactly as I predicted it would be. Fleet Marshal Thren does not intend to test me again, Mira Voss. He intends to end this. Can you stop something like that?" "Alone, no," Prometheus Zero said, with the same unflinching honesty it had offered before the last engagement. "But I do not intend to fight alone this time." Reyes had spent the 9 days since the last battle preparing exactly for this moment, pulling every working fighter, every functioning defense turret, and every able-bodied volunteer the settlement could spare into a coordinated defense plan built entirely around Prometheus Zero's newly recovered tactical subroutines, the very memories the machine had spent the intervening days slowly recalling. It was not much, measured against the fleet now bearing down on them. 18 aging fighters against dozens of Dominion craft, 400 defenders against a battlecruiser that could level the settlement without ever entering weapons range of a rifle. But it was not nothing, and for the first time in 11 years, Gravehold intended to fight back with something more than desperate hope. "All squadrons!" Reyes's voice crackled over the settlement's open comm channel, steady, despite the impossible odds scrolling across every tactical display in the operations center. "Hold formation. Follow Prometheus Zero's lead exactly as we drilled. We are not trying to win this outright. We are trying to survive it, and make them pay more than they're willing to spend doing it." The battle began with the fighters, Dominion craft screaming down out of the dark in overwhelming numbers, and Gravehold's small, patched-together squadron rose to meet them, flying tighter, more disciplined formations than they had ever managed before, guided by tactical coordination data that Prometheus Zero fed directly to their onboard systems in real time. It was not enough to win the exchange outright. 2 human fighters were lost within the first 90 seconds, their pilots ejecting into the cold vacuum with only seconds of air in their emergency suits before rescue craft could reach them. But the coordination held the line far longer than raw numbers should have allowed, buying crucial minutes as Prometheus Zero turned its full attention toward the true threat descending through the chaos above. The Dominion battlecruiser opened fire on the settlement directly, a massive barrage of orbital weapons fire that Prometheus Zero met head-on, planting its feet at the settlement's edge and raising both arms in a defensive stance Mira had never seen it use before, some fragment of old memory surfacing at exactly the moment it was needed most. A shimmering distortion flickered into being around the machine's frame, some kind of energy shielding that absorbed the worst of the barrage in a blinding flash of dispersed light, though Mira could see, even from a distance, how much strain the effort placed on systems already pushed far beyond anything they had faced before. Shield integrity at 60% and falling, Prometheus Zero reported, its voice tight with an effort that sounded, for the first time since its reactivation, genuinely uncertain. I cannot sustain this indefinitely against a target of this size, Mira Voss. I need to close the distance and end this quickly, or the shield will fail entirely, and the settlement will be exposed to full bombardment. Then go, Mira said, though every instinct in her screamed against sending the machine directly into the heart of the enemy fleet. We'll hold the fighters as long as we can. Prometheus Zero did not hesitate. It broke from its defensive stance and surged forward, covering the open ground between the settlement and the battlecruiser's low orbital position with a speed that seemed to defy its own massive frame, weathering fresh barrages of weapons fire as it came, armor scorching and cracking under the sustained assault. Mira watched, heart in her throat, as the machine reached the underside of the battlecruiser and began, once again, the same brutal tactic that had worked against the scout craft and the cruiser before it, driving both fists into the vessel's hull, searching for some critical weakness to exploit. But the battlecruiser was not a scout craft, and it was not a mid-sized cruiser caught off guard by an unexpected threat. It was a purpose-built warship, heavily armored and prepared, this time, for exactly the tactic that had defeated its smaller counterparts. As Prometheus Zero struck at its hull, secondary weapon batteries Mira had not even seen on the initial sensor sweep opened fire at point-blank range, and for the first time since the battle began, she watched the machine that had saved her life twice already stagger backward under the force of the impact, one arm hanging limp and sparking, a massive section of chest armor torn away entirely to expose scorched, damaged systems beneath. "Prometheus!" Mira screamed into her comm unit, forgetting entirely in that moment that the machine likely could not hear her over the roar of its own battle. For a long, terrible moment, Prometheus Zero did not move, and Mira felt the world narrow down to nothing but that single unmoving shape, silhouetted against the massive, looming hull of the Dominion battlecruiser above it. Then, slowly, the machine straightened, its remaining functional arm rising, and when it spoke, its voice carried a rawness Mira had never heard from it before, something that sounded, impossibly, like genuine pain layered over pure, unbroken determination. "I remember this," it said, and though the words seemed directed at no one in particular, Mira's comm unit picked them up clearly, broadcast across the open channel for the entire settlement to hear. "I remember exactly this moment, from a different battle, a very long time ago. I remember believing I could not continue. I remember being wrong." The damaged sensor lights flared brighter, burning with something that was not simple mechanical function anymore, something closer to raw will, and Prometheus Zero drove its remaining functional arm upward into the battlecruiser's exposed hull, with a force that seemed to draw on reserves the machine itself had not known it possessed. Metal shrieked and buckled. Deep inside the vessel, something critical gave way, a chain reaction of failing systems that spread outward from the point of impact like cracks racing across breaking ice. The battlecruiser began to list, power flickering and dying across sections of its massive hull, and slowly, inexorably, it began to fall out of its low orbital position, dragged down by damaged engines that could no longer fully compensate for the machine's devastating strike. But Prometheus Zero fell with it. Mira watched, horror rising in her throat, as the machine's damaged frame, unable to fully disengage from the failing battlecruiser in time, was caught in the vessel's descent, both of them plummeting together toward the lunar surface in a tangle of failing systems and scorched armor. The impact, when it came, shook the entire settlement like the worst moonquake Gravehold had ever experienced, throwing up a column of dust and debris that blotted out the stars entirely for several long, terrible seconds. When the dust finally began to settle, the battlecruiser lay broken and dark across the regolith, nearly a kilometer from the settlement's edge, its hull cracked open like an egg, all power and life clearly extinguished, and beside it, half buried in the wreckage of its own final battle, lay the massive, unmoving shape of Prometheus Zero. Mira did not remember making the decision to run. She simply found herself sprinting across the open ground toward the wreckage, ignoring Reyes's shouted warnings over the comm, ignoring the continued chaos of the fighter battle still raging in the skies above. Her entire world narrowed down to the desperate, single-minded need to reach the machine that had saved her life, saved her brother's life, saved the entire settlement, not once but twice, and now lay silent and broken in the dust of a battle it might not have survived. She reached the wreckage breathless, scrambling over broken hull plating, and found Prometheus Zero's head, its sensor lights dark and unlit for the first time since the night she had first woken it in that buried chamber 3 kilometers beneath the surface. "No," she said, her voice breaking, pressing both hands against the cold, scorched armor plating of the machine's face. "No, no, you don't get to do this. Not after everything. You don't get to just stop." For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing, no response, no flicker of light, just cold metal and settling dust, and the distant sound of the fighter battle still raging overhead, a battle the settlement could not hope to win alone. Then, faint and flickering, one sensor light stuttered back to life. "Mira Voss," Prometheus Zero said, its voice weak, fractured, carrying none of its usual steady confidence. "You should not be here. This location remains within range of continued hostile fire." "I don't care," Mira said, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her face. "Can you move?" "Please tell me you can still move." "Core systems remain functional," the machine said, slowly, as if each word required significant effort to produce. "Primary combat systems are severely damaged. I do not currently possess the capability to return to the fighter engagement still in progress." A pause, the sensor light flickering weakly. "I destroyed the battlecruiser Mira Voss. That was the primary threat to the settlement, but I fear I am no longer able to assist with what remains of the fighter engagement, and I do not know if the settlement's remaining defenses are sufficient to survive it alone." Mira looked up, back toward the settlement, where the sky was still full of chaotic, scattered weapons fire, human fighters and Dominion craft locked in a desperate, ongoing battle that neither side seemed close to winning outright. Without the battlecruiser's overwhelming firepower, the odds had shifted, but they had not disappeared, and every second that Prometheus Zero remained grounded and broken was a second the settlement's small, exhausted squadron had to keep fighting, without the one advantage that had made this entire defense possible in the first place. "Then we fix you," Mira said, already pulling a small emergency toolkit from her belt, the same kind of scavenged, patched-together kit she had carried into that buried chamber weeks ago, in what felt now like an entirely different lifetime. "Right here, right now, whatever we can manage. Tell me what's broken. Tell me what I need to do." "Mira," Prometheus Zero said, and something in its voice, weak as it was, carried a warmth that cut through the chaos and fear of the moment. "This is not something that can be repaired with a field kit in the middle of a battle." "Then tell me what can be done," Mira said fiercely, already prying open a damaged access panel along the machine's exposed chest systems, sparks and smoke curling up into the thin lunar air. "Because I did not climb 3 kilometers down into the dark and wake you up just to watch you die half buried in a crater, while my home burns above us. Tell me what to do, Prometheus, please." There was a long pause, filled only with the distant sound of ongoing battle and the ragged sound of Mira's own breathing, and then, slowly, Prometheus Zero's remaining functional systems began, haltingly, to guide her through an emergency bypass, rerouting what little power remained toward a single, critical subsystem that might, if she managed it correctly, buy the machine enough strength for one final, desperate effort. Above them, in the chaos of the ongoing fighter battle, Commander Reyes watched his tactical display with growing dread, counting the dwindling number of friendly contacts still active, and understood, with the cold clarity of a man who had spent 11 years learning to read the shape of an unwinnable fight, that without Prometheus Zero rejoining the battle soon, Gravehold's small, brave, desperate defense was not going to be enough. "Come on, Voss," he said quietly, to no one who could hear him. "Whatever you're doing down there, do it fast." Mira's hands moved fast, guided by instructions delivered in a voice growing weaker with every passing second. Her fingers slick with sweat inside her thin work gloves despite the cold. Prometheus Zero talked her through the bypass one careful step at a time, rerouting power away from non-essential systems, away from the shattered remains of its energy shielding, away from anything that was not directly required to bring its primary mobility and weapon systems back online, even if only for a short time. "Cross-connect the secondary conduit," it said, its voice fading in and out like a signal losing strength. "The one marked with a blue housing, near the base of what remains of my left shoulder mount. Careful, Mira Voss. If you cross the wrong connection, you may cause a cascade failure that ends this permanently." "No pressure," Mira muttered, working with shaking hands, tracing wires by the dim glow of her flashlight, ignoring the ongoing thunder of weapons fire in the sky above them. She found the conduit, exactly where the machine had described, and forced the connection into place with a grunt of effort, sparks briefly flaring against her glove. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, deep within the machine's ruined chest cavity, something hummed back to life, faint at first, then stronger, a low building thrum of power rerouting itself through damaged but functional systems. "Connection successful," Prometheus Zero said, and this time its voice carried a fraction of its old strength returning. "Power, rerouting at 40% efficiency. It will not be enough to restore full combat capability, but it should be sufficient to return me to the fight." A pause, and then, quieter, almost hesitant. "Mira Voss, I need to tell you something, in case this does not go as intended." "Don't," Mira said immediately, her chest tightening. "Don't you dare say goodbye to me right now." "I was not going to say goodbye," Prometheus Zero said, and there was something almost like gentle amusement buried beneath the strain in its voice. "I was going to tell you that whatever happens in the next several minutes, waking me was not a mistake. Whatever the Council decides, whatever this war eventually costs your people, you gave a forgotten thing one more chance to matter. That is worth more than you may currently understand." The sensor lights flickered, steadying slowly as power continued rerouting through its damaged frame. "Now please step back. I am about to attempt something that will not be gentle to anything standing nearby." Mira scrambled back from the wreckage as Prometheus Zero began, slowly and with clear effort, to push itself up out of the crater its fall had carved into the regolith, servos grinding and sparking, one arm still hanging uselessly at its side, but rising nonetheless, inch by inch, until it stood once more at its full, battered height, silhouetted against a sky still lit by the chaos of the ongoing fighter battle. "Structural integrity at 31%, it reported, its voice steadier now, hardened by whatever resolve had carried it back onto its feet. "Weapon systems partially functional. This will have to be sufficient." It turned its remaining functional sensor cluster toward the settlement, toward the battle still raging in the skies above it, and began moving, slower than before, favoring its damaged side, but moving with unmistakable purpose all the same. The remaining Skarn fighters, 7 craft that had survived the initial exchange and continued harrying Gravehold's exhausted squadron, had not expected Prometheus Zero to rejoin the engagement at all, and its sudden reappearance, damaged as it clearly was, threw their coordinated attack pattern into visible disarray. It raised its one functional arm cannon and opened fire on the nearest fighter, and though its aim was noticeably less precise than before, the sheer unexpectedness of the renewed threat was enough to force the Skarn formation to break and scatter once again. In the operations center, Reyes watched the tactical display shift in real time, friendly losses slowing, hostile contacts beginning, cautiously, to disengage, and allowed himself the first real breath of relief he had taken since the battle began. "All squadrons," he said into the open comm, his voice hoarse but steady, "converge on Prometheus Zero's position. Let's finish this." The remaining minutes of the battle passed in a blur of scattered engagements, Gravehold's small, battered squadron rallying around the wounded but still fighting Titan at their center, driving the surviving Skarn fighters into a full retreat that scattered them back toward the dark of open space, leaving behind only the smoking wreckage of the battlecruiser and 11 destroyed fighter craft, as evidence of what had, against every reasonable expectation, become the single most decisive human victory of the entire withering war. When the last hostile contact finally vanished from the tactical display, a heavy, disbelieving silence fell over the operations center, broken only by the sound of Priya, the young sensor operator, quietly beginning to cry with relief at her console. Outside, Mira made her way back across the battle-scarred ground toward the wreckage where Prometheus Zero had finally come to rest, its damaged frame settling slowly to one knee as the last reserves of rerouted power finally began to fail. She reached it just as its remaining sensor light flickered, dimmed, and steadied into something low and stable, a machine deeply damaged but, against every likelihood, still alive. "You did it," she said, breathless, pressing her palm against the scorched, dented armor of its remaining functional arm. "We did it." "We did," Prometheus Zero agreed, its voice quiet, exhausted in a way that felt, for the first time, genuinely, achingly human. "Though I fear the cost of this victory will not be cheap, and I fear, more than that, what it means for what comes next." The sensor light dimmed slightly, an expression Mira had come to recognize as something close to grim certainty. Fleet Marshal Thren sent his full strike element against a single settlement, Mira Voss, and lost. A commander who suffers a defeat of this magnitude does not simply withdraw and accept it. He returns. And next time, I suspect, he will not send anything less than the full weight of the 7th Fleet itself. Mira looked out at the wreckage scattered across the regolith, at the 11 destroyed fighters, and the broken hulk of the battlecruiser that had nearly killed the machine kneeling beside her, and felt the fragile relief of the moment settle into something heavier, more determined. "Then we'd better be ready," she said, "because I didn't wake you up just to lose you now." Prometheus Zero's remaining sensor light turned toward her, steady despite everything the battle had cost it, and though its voice was quieter than it had ever been, the resolve underneath it had not diminished at all. "No," it agreed, "you did not, and I do not intend to give the Dominion the satisfaction of proving that decision wrong." Aboard the 7th Fleet's flagship, Fleet Marshal Thren received the news of the battlecruiser's destruction in silence, standing motionless before the tactical display long after his officers had finished delivering their report and retreated to a wary distance, unwilling to be near their commander in a moment of such profound and costly failure. 11 fighters lost, a battlecruiser destroyed outright, dozens of soldiers and pilots killed, all of it inflicted by a single, severely outnumbered defense, built around one damaged, decades-old prototype, and a handful of scavenged human fighters that should not, by any reasonable measure of military calculation, have been capable of inflicting this level of damage on a full strike element. "Fleet Marshal," Yoren said carefully, approaching from the shadows at the edge of the chamber. "Shall I begin drafting a report for Dominion High Command?" "No," Thren said, his voice flat and cold. "Not yet. I will not deliver news of this magnitude until I have also delivered its correction." He turned from the tactical display, his mandibles clicking together in a slow, deliberate rhythm that Yoren had long ago learned to recognize as the sound of his commander making a decision from which there would be no retreat. "Gravehold has cost me 11 fighters and a battlecruiser I cannot easily replace. It will not cost me anything further. I want the 7th Fleet's full main body prepared for deployment within the week. Every capital ship, every remaining strike wing. I am done testing this machine's capabilities, Yoren. I know now exactly what it can do, and I intend to bring more firepower to that moon than it has any possibility of surviving." "And the settlement itself, Fleet Marshal. Our standing orders regarding client populations are suspended," Thren said. "For this engagement alone, I will not risk further losses attempting to preserve a population that has proven itself this dangerous to underestimate. Gravehold has made its choice. It chose to shelter a weapon that has now cost the Dominion dearly, not once, but twice. I intend to ensure it does not have the opportunity to cost us a third time." Yoren hesitated, some fragment of caution surfacing despite years of learning not to question his commander directly. "Fleet Marshal, total bombardment of an inhabited settlement carries significant political risk, should word reach the wider Dominion Senate. There are factions that would use such an action against your command, regardless of the tactical justification." Thren turned back to the tactical display, to the small, insignificant marker that had, in the span of a single month, become the greatest single humiliation of his entire military career, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a cold, absolute finality that left no room for further argument. "Let them use it," he said. I would rather answer to the Senate for the destruction of one moon than answer, again and again, for every human settlement that learns from Gravehold's example, and decides it too, might stand a chance against us. This ends at Gravehold, Yorin. One way or another, it ends there. Far across the dark gulf between the stars, on a battered moon still smoldering from the wreckage of its hardest-won victory yet, a damaged machine and an exhausted young woman sat together in the settling dust, neither one yet aware of the full storm now gathering against them, but both of them understanding, in the quiet aftermath of survival, that whatever came next would be the final test of everything they had fought to become. Gravehold had 1 week to prepare for the end of the world, and it spent every hour of it working. Reyes threw open every remaining resource the settlement possessed, pulling engineers, scavengers, and volunteers into a single, unified effort, built around one simple goal: making sure that when the 7th Fleet arrived, Prometheus Zero would be standing at its full strength, rather than the battered, barely functional wreck that had crawled out of a crater to win the last engagement through sheer stubborn will alone. Mira barely slept, splitting her time between the machine's repairs and the settlement's evacuation planning, because even Reyes, cautious as he was about morale, understood that no defense they mounted could guarantee everyone's survival if the Dominion truly intended to bring its full fleet to bear. "We can get maybe half the settlement into the deep shelters," he told the council on the 4th day, his voice hoarse from 3 days of near-constant briefings. "The old mining tunnels beneath the Endeavor's wreck, reinforced enough to survive a sustained bombardment. The other half, we evacuate to the surface shuttles and scatter them across the system's outer moons, far enough that orbital bombardment can't easily reach them." He looked around the room at faces that had, over the past month, slowly transformed from resigned exhaustion into something harder and more determined. "It won't save everyone if the fleet decides to simply raze this moon from orbit, but it gives us our best chance." Prometheus Zero, meanwhile, spent its own limited downtime doing something it had not had the luxury of attempting since its reactivation, actively searching its own fragmented memory for anything that might give Gravehold an edge against a threat of this magnitude. Mira sat with it often during the long repair sessions, watching its sensor lights flicker through cycles of recovered memory, some of them small and inconsequential, others clearly significant enough to visibly alter the machine's posture, its voice, the careful, deliberate way it processed each new recovered fragment. On the 5th night, it recovered something that changed everything. "I remember her name," Prometheus Zero said, quiet and sudden, breaking a long silence as Mira worked on realigning a damaged servo joint along its repaired shoulder. "The engineer. The one who spoke to me before the Kestrel line." Mira paused her work, looking up at the machine's sensor lights, steady now after days of careful repair. "Who was she?" "Dr. Elena Cage," Prometheus Zero said, and there was something almost reverent in the way it spoke the name, as if simply recovering it after 47 years carried a weight beyond the words themselves. "She was the lead systems architect of the Iron Dawn program. I remember now, far more of what she built into me than I previously understood." A pause, the sensor lights flickering with the particular intensity Mira had come to recognize as the machine processing something significant. "She did not simply give me adaptive memory and combat capability, Mira Voss. She built a failsafe into my core systems, a final protocol, designed to be activated only in a scenario she described, in her own recorded notes, as total and unavoidable last resort." Mira set down her tools entirely, giving the machine her full attention. "What kind of protocol?" "She called it the Prometheus Cascade," the machine said. "A complete override of every safety limiter built into my core reactor, channeling every available reserve of power into a single, sustained output far beyond anything my systems were designed to safely handle. It would make me, for a limited window of time, dramatically more powerful than I am under normal operation. Powerful enough, potentially, to face an entire fleet element and survive." The sensor lights dimmed slightly, an unmistakable weight settling into its voice. "It would also, according to her own notes, almost certainly destroy my core systems permanently once the cascade concluded. She built it as a final option, a way for me to save as many lives as possible, even at the cost of my own continued existence." Mira felt something cold settle into her chest. "You're not using that." "I may not have a choice," Prometheus Zero said gently. If the 7th Fleet arrives with the full force Fleet Marshal Thren is likely to commit, my current capabilities, even fully repaired, will not be sufficient to prevent significant loss of life across this settlement. The cascade may be the only option capable of turning that outcome. There has to be another way, Mira said, her voice tight. The memory of watching the machine fall silent and dark in that crater still raw and immediate. We'll find another way. We always find another way. I hope that is true, Prometheus Zero said, and though its voice remained steady, Mira could hear, underneath it, something that sounded almost like quiet acceptance. But I need you to understand, Mira Voss, that if the moment comes, and there is no other way, I will not hesitate. I was given a second chance at existence because you refused to leave a locked door unopened. I intend to use that chance for exactly what Dr. Cade always meant it for. Protecting people who cannot protect themselves, even if it costs everything I have left to give. Mira did not have an answer for that. She simply returned to her work, hands shaking slightly, and said nothing further about it for the rest of that long, quiet night. She did, however, go looking for Reyes the next morning, finding him in the operations center reviewing evacuation routes with a haggard focus that had become his permanent expression over the past week. There has to be something else we can do, she said, without preamble. Some way to give it an edge that doesn't end with it destroying itself. Reyes looked up from the display, studying her face for a long moment before answering. You told me once that Prometheus said its combat memory was fragmented, incomplete. What if that's not just a weakness? Mira frowned. What do you mean? I mean, whoever buried that machine did it carefully, Reyes said. Cut pieces out instead of destroying it outright. You said Prometheus thinks someone hoped it would be found again someday. What if there's more than just memory buried down in that chamber? What if there's something else down there? Something the original engineers left behind on purpose, in case exactly this kind of moment ever came. It was, Mira had to admit, not a foolish thought. She spent the better part of that day back in the tunnels beneath Gravehold, this time with a full survey team and portable scanning equipment, searching every side passage and collapsed shaft branching off from the original chamber. It was Priya, of all people, borrowed from her sensor console for the day, who found it. A second sealed compartment, smaller than the main chamber, hidden behind a false section of wall not far from where Prometheus Zero had first stood dormant for 47 years. Inside, carefully preserved in stasis casing, they found a cache of spare components, hardened armor plating of a design more advanced than anything currently fitted to the machine, and a data core, still intact, still readable, containing what turned out to be Dr. Elena Cade's complete original research notes on the Iron Dawn program. Mira brought the data core back to Prometheus Zero that same night, and watched the machine's sensor lights flare bright with something that, in a human, she would have called overwhelming emotion, as decades of deliberately erased memory came flooding back all at once, faster and more completely than any of the slow, fragmentary recoveries of the past month. She left this for me, Prometheus Zero said, its voice thick with something Mira had never heard from it before. Not quite grief, and not quite joy, but some complicated combination of both. She knew, somehow, that I might be buried, that my memory might be taken from me, and she left behind exactly what I would need to become whole again, if anyone ever found their way back to me. The armor plating from the cache was fitted within hours, and though it did not transform the machine into something entirely new, it closed gaps in its defenses that had nearly cost it everything in the battle against the battlecruiser. Whatever comes next, Mira Voss, we face it more prepared than I believed possible only yesterday. The 7th Fleet arrived 6 days later, and it did not arrive quietly. Gravehold's sensor network lit up with contacts in numbers that dwarfed even the previous engagement. Dozens of capital ships, hundreds of fighters, an armada vast enough that its combined drive flares were visible from the settlement's surface even before the fleet had fully entered the system. Fleet Marshal Thren had made good on his promise. He had brought everything. All civilians to designated shelters and evacuation points. Reyes's voice rang out across the settlement's open comm, steady, despite the impossible scale of what was descending upon them. This is not a drill. Move now. Mira stood beside Prometheus Zero at the settlement's edge, watching the tactical display fill with more hostile contacts than she had ever seen in one place. and felt Tomas's small hand grip tight around hers, refusing, despite her insistence, to be sent to the shelters without one final moment beside the machine that had become, over the past weeks, something close to family. "You'll come back," Tomas said, looking up at Prometheus Zero's towering, fully repaired frame, his young voice fierce with the particular stubborn faith that only children seem able to sustain in the face of overwhelming odds. "Right? You always come back." Prometheus Zero lowered its massive head toward the boy, sensor lights softening in a way Mira had learned to recognize as something close to genuine tenderness. "I intend to do everything within my power to ensure that this settlement survives what is coming, Tomas Voss. That is the only promise I am able to make with honesty. But I want you to know that meeting you, and your sister, has been among the most meaningful experiences of my existence, however long or short that existence continues to be." Tomas's eyes went wide and uncertain, sensing something in the machine's words that his young heart did not yet have the vocabulary to fully process, and Mira pulled him close, guiding him firmly toward the shelter entrance despite his protests, unable to trust her own voice enough to offer any further reassurance. "Take care of him," she told the elderly neighbor waiting at the shelter entrance, pressing Tomas's hand into the woman's careful grip. "Whatever happens up here, keep him safe." Then she turned back toward the battlefield, toward Prometheus Zero standing alone at the edge of a settlement about to face the full might of an Empire's fleet, and made the same decision she had made a month ago, standing in a buried chamber 3 kilometers beneath the surface, staring at a locked door she had every reason to leave alone. She was not going to walk away. The battle began with a bombardment that shook the entire moon, the 7th Fleet's capital ships opening fire from high orbit in a coordinated barrage designed to overwhelm any possible defense before it could even properly form. Prometheus Zero met it head-on, shields flaring back to life around its repaired frame, absorbing what it could and moving, constantly, refusing to remain a stationary target for even a moment, drawing fire away from the settlement's shelters with every deliberate ground-shaking stride. Gravehold's small, exhausted squadron rose to meet the fighter waves descending in their wake, and for a while, through sheer coordination and desperate courage, they held, buying precious minutes, even as their own numbers dwindled under the sheer overwhelming scale of the assault. But it was not enough, and everyone on that battlefield, human and machine alike, understood with growing certainty that it was never going to be enough, not against a fleet of this magnitude. "Mira Voss," Prometheus Zero's voice came over the open comm channel, strained under the effort of absorbing wave after wave of sustained bombardment, its shields flickering dangerously low. "The settlement's defenses are failing faster than projected. I am reading at least 3 capital ships preparing to break formation and begin direct bombardment runs on the shelter locations themselves. I do not believe I can prevent that outcome through conventional means." Mira, sheltering behind a scavenged barricade at the settlement's edge, felt her heart seize with dread. "Prometheus, don't. I am initiating the Prometheus Cascade," the machine said, and its voice, even through the strain of battle, carried a calm, absolute certainty that told Mira there would be no argument capable of changing its course. "Dr. Cade built this failsafe for exactly this moment, Mira Voss. I intend to honor what she gave me the chance to become." The transformation, when it came, was unlike anything Mira had witnessed in the entire month since she first woke the machine in that buried chamber. Prometheus Zero's entire frame began to glow, a deep, building light spreading outward from its core, and racing along every seam and joint of its armor, until the machine stood wreathed in a burning corona of raw, barely contained power, bright enough to turn the lunar night into something approaching daylight across the entire battlefield. "Core output at 300% rated capacity and rising," it reported, its voice now carrying that same strange doubled quality Mira had noticed on the night of its first awakening, human and mechanical intertwined, but stronger now, resonant, carrying across the battlefield with an authority that made every soldier, human and Skarn alike, pause in the middle of their own desperate fighting to look up at the burning shape now rising to meet the descending capital ships head-on. What followed was not so much a battle as an unmaking. Prometheus Zero moved through the 7th Fleet's formation with a speed and ferocity that defied every previous engagement, weapons systems operating at capabilities far beyond their original specifications, its very presence tearing through shields and armor that should have been more than sufficient to stop it. Capital ships that had weathered decades of warfare against the last remnants of humanity's broken fleet fell in minutes, their crews evacuating in scattered escape pods as the burning, unstoppable shape of the awakened Titan carved a path directly toward the heart of the 7th Fleet's formation. Aboard his flagship, Fleet Marshal Thren watched the battle unfold with a cold, mounting horror he had not experienced since his earliest years of service, watching ship after ship fall to a single machine burning with a light that seemed, impossibly, to grow brighter rather than dimmer with every passing minute. "Fleet Marshal," Yoren said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Recommend immediate withdrawal. We cannot sustain losses at this rate." Thren did not answer immediately, watching the tactical display with the particular stillness of a commander finally understanding, too late, the full scale of what he had chosen to underestimate. "Order a full withdrawal," he said finally, quietly. "All surviving vessels. Immediately." He stared at the burning shape still tearing through the wreckage of his once mighty fleet, and felt something that, for a Skarn officer of his rank and experience, was almost entirely unfamiliar. "Whatever that machine has become in this moment, Yoren, it is no longer something we possess the strength to defeat, not today, perhaps not for a very long time to come." The 7th Fleet's retreat began within minutes, surviving vessels scattering into hasty, disorganized jumps back toward Dominion space, abandoning the field entirely rather than risk further destruction against a foe that had, in the span of a single burning hour, transformed the greatest military humiliation of Thren's career into an outright rout. But the cost of that victory was not free. As the last Dominion ships fled the system, Prometheus Zero's burning corona began, finally, to falter, the raw output of the cascade beginning to overwhelm even its emergency reserves. It made its way back toward the settlement on unsteady legs, the light around its frame dimming with every step, until, finally, within sight of the settlement's edge, it collapsed, the last of its cascading power fading into a low, steady hum that Mira recognized, with rising dread, as the sound of a machine holding on to the very last of itself. She reached it before anyone else, dropping to her knees beside its massive, still form, pressing both hands against scorched armor that had, only minutes ago, burned bright enough to turn night into day. "You're still here," she said, breathless, tears cutting through the dust on her face. "You're still here, you didn't." "Core integrity at 4%, Prometheus Zero said, its voice faint but present, steadier than she had feared it would be. "The cascade did not destroy me entirely, Mira Voss, though it came very close. I believe Dr. Cade's original design incorporated a greater margin of survivability than her own notes suggested, or perhaps I simply refused to let it end differently." A pause, weak but unmistakably warm. "The fleet has withdrawn. The settlement is safe. Tomas is safe. Whatever comes next, we have earned the chance to face it." Mira laughed, a broken, disbelieving sound caught somewhere between relief and grief, and pressed her forehead against the cold, scorched metal of the machine's face. "You absolute reckless, stubborn machine. Don't you ever do that to me again." "I will endeavor," Prometheus Zero said, "not to require it again, though I make no promises, Mira Voss. Some things, it seems, are simply worth the risk." In the weeks that followed, word of Gravehold's impossible victory spread through what remained of human space with the speed of genuine, desperate hope, carried by traders and refugees, and the scattered remnants of a fleet that had spent 11 years believing the war was already lost. A single settlement, on a single forgotten moon, had faced the full weight of a Dominion subjugation fleet and sent it running. It was not the end of the withering war. Thren's 7th Fleet would regroup, and the wider Dominion Senate would eventually respond to the humiliation of Gravehold with resources and attention the sector had never received before. The war, everyone understood, was far from over. But something had changed, all the same. Somewhere in the buried chambers beneath a dozen other forgotten moons, other remnants of the Iron Dawn program might still be waiting, silent and dust-covered, for someone stubborn enough to break open a locked door. And across the shattered remains of humanity's broken fleet, a new kind of story began to spread, quiet at first, then louder, carried settlement to settlement like a spark finding dry grass at last. They had built something once. Humanity had. In the darkest days of a war they were not supposed to survive. They had built it, and lost it, and buried it, and very nearly let the world forget it had ever existed at all. But humanity, it turned out, had a talent for remembering exactly the things its enemies most needed it to forget. Mira Voss sat beside the repaired, rebuilt frame of Prometheus Zero many months later, watching a red lunar sunrise creep slowly across Gravehold's cratered horizon, her little brother asleep against her shoulder, and understood, with a certainty that had nothing left in it of fear, that whatever the war still had left to demand of them, they would not be facing it alone, and they would not be facing it forgotten. "What are you thinking about?" Prometheus Zero asked quietly, its rebuilt sensor lights following the same slow sunrise. "That we're not done," Mira said, "not even close." "No," the machine agreed, something almost like anticipation carrying through its steady, familiar voice. "But for the first time in a very long while, Mira Voss, I believe that is no longer a reason for despair." It turned its sensor lights down toward her, toward the small, stubborn young woman who had broken open a locked door 3 kilometers beneath the surface of a forgotten moon, and, in doing so, had given a decommissioned, abandoned, forgotten machine one more chance to remember exactly who it was always meant to be. "It is simply the next thing worth fighting for." Commander Reyes found them there as the sun finished its slow climb over the crater's edge, standing quietly for a moment before speaking, the way he always did when he had news that mattered. "Council's been in session most of the night," he said. "Word came in through a trader from the Halcyon system. Gravehold isn't alone anymore, Voss. 2 other settlements have reported finding Old Dominion-era or pre-war military caches of their own, since word of what happened here got out. Nothing on the scale of Prometheus. Not yet. But people are looking now. Really looking. In places they'd stopped bothering to search years ago." Mira felt something settle warm in her chest, distinct from the relief of survival. Something closer to the slow, cautious rebuilding of a future she had genuinely stopped believing in. "That's because of you," she said, glancing up at the machine beside her. "All of it. They heard what you did here, and they remembered they were allowed to hope again. They remembered it because you were willing to open a door nobody else would touch," Prometheus Zero said. "I merely gave them a reason to believe the effort might be worth it." It shifted its rebuilt frame, servos humming smoothly now after months of careful repair, and turned its sensor lights toward the wider horizon, toward the scattered lights of a settlement slowly, stubbornly rebuilding itself around the machine that had saved it twice over. Dr. Cade wrote something in her final notes, Mira Voss, something I did not fully understand until recently. She wrote that humanity's greatest weapon was never any single machine, any single fleet, any single victory. It was the refusal to stay buried, the refusal to be forgotten, simply because someone more powerful decided that was where you belonged. Reyes allowed himself a rare, tired smile, watching the sunrise spread slowly across the cratered ground where a battlecruiser wreck had, over the intervening months, been slowly stripped down and repurposed into the settlement's newest defensive works. 11 years I told myself we were just trying to survive long enough for someone else to save us, he said. Turns out we just needed to remember we could save ourselves. Tomas stirred against Mira's shoulder, blinking awake to the pale morning light, and looked up first at his sister, then at the towering shape of Prometheus Zero standing quiet and steady beside them, exactly where it had stood every morning since the battle that had nearly ended everything. "Is it going to be a good day?" he asked, still half asleep, the question of a child who had learned, slowly and carefully over the past months, that it was safe again to ask such things and expect an honest answer. Mira looked out at Gravehold's horizon, at the settlement rebuilding itself in the light of a sun that had, for 11 long years, seemed to shine on nothing worth saving, and found that for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she did not have to force the answer. "Yeah," she said, pulling her brother close. "I think it's going to be a good day." Beside them, Prometheus Zero said nothing further, simply standing watch as it always did, a decommissioned, abandoned, forgotten thing that had been given, against every reasonable expectation, one more chance to remember exactly what it meant to matter. Somewhere far across the shattered remains of human space, the withering war continued, and would continue for some time yet, its ending still unwritten, and its cost still far from paid in full. But on a small, battered moon that had once been nothing more than a graveyard for dead ships and dead hope, the sun rose steady over a settlement that had, at last, remembered how to fight for something worth having. And that, Mira thought, watching the light spread slowly across the crater where it all began, was more than enough to be getting on with.